Welcome, everybody, to number 121 of the Circle of Wine Writers Let's Talk series. Today's topic is Let's talk about cultural attitudes towards wine in India and China with Reva, Singh, Ruma Singh, and Janet Wang. I'd like to extend a welcome to those members who are joining for the first time today and those who are non-members. The Circle was founded in 1960 in the UK and has over 270 members today, including wine writers, educators, broadcasters, and other professional communicators. The membership now global with a 50-50 split between the UK and overseas. There's more information about the Circle of Wine Writers on our website, and there's also details about how you can join. I'd now like to hand over to Michelle Shah, who works with Liz Saggies to organise these events, who will introduce our speakers today. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Andrea, and I'm delighted to present three very talented Circle members for our session today. Reva Singh, former university lecturer in English literature, a journalist, founder and publisher of Sommelier India, the wine magazine, the first Indian magazine dedicated to wine in India. Ruma Singh, a highly regarded independent wine and spirit writer and journalist for leading Indian and international publications, an educator, a wine judge, consultant, founder of her online wine magazine, Between the Wines, and in 2009, she became the first female president of the Bangalore Wine Club. And Janet Wang, author of The Chinese Wine Renaissance, shortlisted for the Louis Roederer Wine Book of the Year in 2019, winner of the 2020 Gourmand Awards wine category, speaker on Chinese wine at Channel 4's Sunday Brunch. She runs China-related forums for corporate and social wine events and for universities, and has private tastings at 67 Pall Mall. Thank you all so much for taking time to be with us today, and we're greatly looking forward to this session. And we're going to start with Ruma Singh. So over to you, Ruma. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I hope everyone can hear me. Yeah, okay, perfect. So I'm just going to share my screen because I'm doing a presentation, and let's go. Okay, so welcome to this presentation on wine culture in India. I'm aware that there are quite a few of you who might know a fair amount regarding wine and India, but others may not. So please bear with me while I go over a few introductory facts and figures to bring everyone up to speed. So let's start. I've called this India's wine story, Ancient Origins to Modern Trends. Ancient origins because people consider India a new wine country, but in fact, wine was drunk in India as far back as 3000 BCE, as excavations done in the Indus Valley civilization show. Archaeologists found shards of amphorae which have been used to store wine, so people were drinking wine as far back as then. Also, India was like a melting pot of different cultures and people who came in, conquerors and different people. And this included the Persians and the Greeks. For instance, the Achaemenid Persians under Cyrus the Great conquered parts of the Indus Valley around 535 BCE, and he was followed by Alexander the Great in 327 BCE, and both the Persians and the Greeks were drinking wine at that time, so we assume they brought in some of their culture. Under the Mughals, it's very interesting because this was in the 16th century, and specifically Emperors Babur, Akbar, and Jahangir were actually known to love wine. In fact, those of you who live in London, I'm not sure whether you've seen the Great Mughals exhibition at the V&A, absolutely spectacular. And you might have noticed the jewel-studded wine cups of Emperor Jahangir. So, I mean, I'd love one of those to drink wine out of. Not sure how comfortable it'll be, but yes. So they did drink wine even at the time of the Mughals in the 16th century. But later Mughals, however, frowned on alcohol and wine culture gradually faded. But later in the 16th century came the Portuguese. the first of the Europeans to come to India, and they were followed by the French. So they brought their own grapes and wine culture with them. So basically, we can say that wine has been there from very, very long ago, and it's not new. Okay, right. Let's jump straight into the 1980s, because that is when, in the modern era, wine came about and found a resurgence once again. And this actually happened. There were a few producers who we can regard as pioneers in the 1980s. One of them is Chateau Indage, and they pioneered modern Indian winemaking. And they, in fact, had a sparkling wine called Marquise de Pompadour, very grand. And soon others followed, which also includes the Grover Vineyards in its original avatar. And owner Kamal Grover actually brought in George Vassell from Champagne Mum to help him plant his vineyards in Karnataka. Soon others followed, and wineries started growing clustered around the two states of Karnataka and Maharashtra, which you can see on the map there. They're fairly close to each other. And even today, they remain the main centers of wine production and consumption. Or we can come back a little bit later to these two if you have any questions during the Q&A section. But of course, it wasn't all easy. India is a very large country of 28 individual states. We call it a subcontinent because it really is. And alcohol is a state subject. So each state legislates its own alcohol policies. And some states like Karnataka and Maharashtra, which I mentioned, have relatively liberal alcohol policies. Others have partial government control, while still others are completely dry and have prohibition. So it's a very complex situation. India also, and this is worth bearing in mind, does not have an overarching administrative body that regulates grape and wine production. So the figures and data, which I will present in the course of the next few slides, are actually estimates, but they're estimates from IWSR and the Wine Growers Association of India, which is a premium association of wine producers, and they have very kindly given me some data to share. So early hurdles. The early hurdles challenges included low quality grapes, as you can expect, and low awareness of wine at this stage in the 1980s and 90s. Expertise in winemaking was also fairly limited. In fact, initially the grapes used to make wine were either crosses or hybrids or table grapes even, locally bred with parental material brought in from abroad. For example, there's one called Anbe Shahi. There was another one called Tasa Ganesh. And then there was a hybrid Isabella, which is, I think, brought in by the Portuguese, which is now in India as a table grape and is called Bangalore Blue. But all these grapes were used to make wine. In those days, there weren't really any Cabernets and Shiraz, etc., etc. But as this started, the government realized that viticulture is, something which could give employment to the population, and they started supporting the sector. And the wine industry began its comeback, you can say, in the 80s. And most states have varied alcohol policies, as I mentioned. So let's have a look at India today. What is the total market size? 3 million cases of 9 liters per case is what I've been told by the IWSR, of which domestic wine consumption is 2 million cases. Imported wine is around 1 million cases, though this number could possibly have dropped a bit since Pernod Ricard sold its wine business, and their wine, Jacob's Creek, was one of the biggest sellers in India. So that was the situation. 3 million cases of wine is what we have today. But there's always been growth. And till 2019, till the pandemic, there was a 15% year-on-year growth, which is not bad at all. Then came the pandemic, and of course, everything went haywire. 22 saw a bit of a resurgence, but then 2023 and 24 have seen a decline of 10% year on year, which is more or less in keeping with world trends. Key consumption markets are the big metros: Mumbai, New Delhi, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Goa, Kolkata, and Pune. And this interest in wine consumption has been driven by a higher disposable income in these cities and exposure to travel and global culinary culture. So let's have a look at evolving consumer tastes. When it all started, the initial preference, as I'm sure is in a lot of other countries, was for sweet, red, and fortified wine. This has changed quite considerably, though you still have those sections who do like their sweet, red, and fortified wine. But the premium market has moved completely to dry wine, and premium consumers definitely have shown that they only want dry wine. Sweet wine doesn't really sell here in India. There's an international awareness and a growing knowledge of global styles. New World wine is gaining traction, not only because it's simpler to read, it's a little bit less expensive than a lot of the old world wines from premium regions. And when you see Sauvignon Blanc on the label, you know what you're drinking. So for beginners, it is useful. However, for the premium drinkers and those who are have been drinking wine for a while, France and Italy and their premium regions still rule. Urban middle class and youth consume more wine, and social media has been a big aid of late, projecting the image of wine as a classy and healthy beverage. And of course, there is wine bars, wine clubs, and communities. We'll come to that a little bit more going forward. And they've been promoting a lot of education and understanding and knowledge of wine among consumers. So a few insights. It's still red. Red wine still dominates to the extent of 65 to 70% of consumers. There has been a clear growth, but this is fairly recent, of rosé, but this is basically Indian rosé. And this is because Fratelli and Sula, two of the biggest wine producers, are now making premium rosés, which are far more affordable than say the Provence rosés, which are being imported because of the price and the taxes. There is some growth in sparkling wine, but that's mostly at the entry level. Cans are also doing fairly well with sparkling wine. What's noticeable is there is an increase in casual consumption. While occasion-based consumption as weddings, celebrations, etc., still dominate, but casual consumption is definitely on the rise. Casual at-home drinking, stopping by on your way back from work at the wine bar and having a glass of wine and things like that are definitely on the upward move. Correspondingly, a demand for wine education is growing. I've been told by the APPs there's a distinct increase in international providers like WSET, Court of Master Sommeliers, Wine Scholar Guild, Cordon Bleu courses, despite the fact that these courses cost more in India, which is again linked to the cost of wine. There's the rise of the freelance educator and wine events. But many of these influencers, say the Wine Association, Wine Growers Association, they engage in not just wine, but other alcoholic beverages, resulting in some dilution of focus, and wine falls behind spirits. In fact, India is still very much a spirit-driven country by a huge margin. And it also is because the spirit companies in India tend to be the big multinationals such as Diageo and Pernod Ricard, and they have considerable marketing budgets, which the wine companies do not really have. But overall, you can say Indian wine tastes are maturing, consumers appreciate diverse wine experiences, but however, prices remain a challenge. So, who are wine drinkers in India? IWSR, the BevTrack 2024 survey, puts the number at 20 million upper income consumers. But this is just 1 to 2% of the population, and they're the ones driving wine consumption. Out of this, 65% are Generation Z and millennials, and they are leading wine adoption. And out of that, there's 50% under the age of 25, educated, well-traveled, a thriving demographic with some disposable income at their disposal, increased exposure of wine through travel, and a willingness to try new product. They also are very highly educated and fluent in English, making them highly receptive to international wine culture and sophisticated marketing. Let's have a quick look at the current consumption data. This too is from IWSR, and they say that domestic wine is consumed by 84% of wine consumers. So the emphasis is on domestic wine by a long chalk. Premium wine, and they put premium wine as costing 2,293 plus, or approximately 23 euros a bottle of 750 ml. This premium wine is only 3%, and 100% of it is imported. What they also say, and which is very heartening, is that in the last 3 years, the Indians have shown an increasing level of wine knowledge. Growth has been driven by Gen X and millennials with a high awareness of brand, regions, countries compared to 3 years ago. And this is creating unique opportunities for premium positioning and education-driven marketing strategy. And as far as domestic wine is concerned, what was the game changer here was the Make in India, a catchphrase which was launched by the Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, during the pandemic and then thereafter. What it actually means is taking pride in products made in India, and that include wine. So this catchphrase appealed to the patriotic in all the consumers, and also, let's not forget, cost advantage over imports. So, the fastest growing segment, I call it the wine curious. I love that phrase. And these are consumers aged 25 to 45 years, and majority are women. This is actually really, really heartening. There are new wine communities springing up across India in the last 2-3 years, really fast, brought about by young freelance educators and organizers who focus on informal wine events, which is not the formal teaching of courses, but casual tasting, games, quizzes, experiential learning. And some of these are, like, for instance, Drink with D is a multi-city organization, which is a community, I should say, which is run by a young som called Devti. There's Wine in a Million, which is also doing the same thing. There is the Wine Community Bangalore, which has grown in the last 2 years, 3 years, hugely, which is a community of wine professionals or professionals in the wine business in various fields, from sommeliers to marketers to salespeople. And they are actually helping spread education and knowledge and opportunity, which includes jobs, among the community. So these communities host theme tasting, co-host winemaker dinner, and basically offer the consumer a greater choice of wine and learning, and of course, tasting opportunities, which is so important. The demographics, it's interesting. The demographics, 60 to 70% are in the age group 25 to 35, 20 to 30% between 35 and 45, and 10%, not an inconsiderable amount, 10% is quite a large figure, are 45 years plus, which shows that there are older people also being drawn to wine. 70% of them are women, and all are looking to meet and engage with fellow wine lovers on the same journey, expand their social circle.
Wow.
So this is something which is really something which is very good, which is happening.
Sorry, Rumas, don't want to interrupt, but we must close your session to pass on.
Yeah, it's the last
Thank you
couple
so
of
much.
slides.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what can make a difference? One would be, of course, opportunities to grow the community and grow the wine consumer. And that would be wine tourism is taking off in a very big way. And this slide and this photograph is of Sula Vineyards, which is the largest vineyard producer in India. And they tell me that in 2024, they saw 381,837 visitors, up 10%. And this was a strong post-pandemic recovery, which they had. They also have rooms, they have two hospitality offerings called The Source and Beyond. And that has over 100 rooms with a high season occupancy of 92%. Their tasting room is a major draw. And they are very proud of the fact that more Indians have had their first taste of wine at the Sula tasting room than anywhere else. So also as regard to the demographic, this reflects pretty much what we've seen in the previous slides. Youngsters, Gen X, millennials, looking for experience-driven wine.
Thank you so much, Ruma. I think we should pass on to Reva and
I'll just exit.
Thank you, Ruma.
thank you so much. I think Reva's going to pick up with her experience in publishing.
Yes.
And the first Indian magazine totally dedicated to wine,
Yeah.
right?
So, hello, everybody. It's really good to be here and talking about my favorite subject. And Ruma's done such a wonderful job, so I don't have to delve into any of those details. But I can tell you about my journey in wine. People used to ask, how come, you chose wine? What is your background in wine? And I said, well, I don't have a very great background in wine. I was just a consumer and a lover of wine. And my background is in magazine publishing. And we had been living overseas for a while. My husband is a retired now international banker, and we moved every 2 or 3 years. And this time when we came back to India, we were amazed that people were drinking more wine than whiskey. And we were now producing wine in a big way. We were importing wine, but nobody knew very much about wine. And I used to joke with people when I spoke about it that even in this male chauvinist city of Delhi, no one could turn around and say, what does she know about wine? Because I knew a whole lot more than any of them did. And to illustrate this, when I was discussing what should I call the magazine, and I knew about, had been reading the Wine Spectator and Decanter, and somebody suggested carafe and things like that, copycat type. And I said, what do you think of sommelier? And you won't believe me, this was to my book club members, and they didn't know the meaning of sommelier. Now, this brings to the fore that we really didn't have a wine drinking culture worth the name. We're an English-speaking country. We have, our education is in English medium, but nobody knew the meaning of sommelier. So much so that in the first edition, I called it sommelier because I wanted it to be to convey that this was a serious magazine on wine. Everything else that was published at the time was just cliches. It was red wine, white wine, and so on. And the only wine we got when I was young and growing up was either champagne and sherry and port. And the culture was so different to what Ruma's been talking about at that time. The men drank copious amounts of whiskey, scotch, preferably, and they didn't consider it suitable for women to drink spirits. So we were offered sherry and port, which we loved. It was sweet and had a lot of alcohol, but we never thought of it as wine. So when I started the magazine, I called it, and this is the first issue. I call it a newsletter. It was only, can you see it? It was just 16 pages, and the letter from the editor was printed here, and this was it. So I said, oh, sorry, this is not the first issue. This is the one. This is the first issue. And I said, Dear wine enthusiast, welcome to Sommelier India, India's first newsletter dedicated to wine and wine lovers. Why sommelier? And then I went on to explain what it was. And subsequently, I used to, and even to this day, I print it at the bottom. Sommelier, give the pronunciation, and say French for wine steward, your friendly guide to the world of wine. So this is how it started. And now it's been, we're in our 21st year, and it's grown into, this is the new edition, which is going to press. This is actually a dummy, which means the press gives it to me so I can pick up any mistakes and things. I still have to write my letter. There's a blank here, but he's on the cover. This is Dr. Madhya Ravana. So the magazine is not only about Indian wine, especially in the beginning, there was only so much you could say about Indian wine. It's I would tell my readers and people who are interested that this is your window on the world of wine. So we cover all kinds of regions, and he's an Indian cardiologist who is a great wine producer now and wine collector. It makes a fascinating story. He's Indian. So that was my where I have reached, but it was fascinating the time that I spent. People would ask me, oh yes, first of all, when I went to the asked a designer to design the magazine, I said, she said, what are you going to be doing? I was bringing out the Oberoi Group magazine at the time, and she used to design that as well. I said, a wine magazine. She said, a wine magazine? Why a wine magazine? She didn't think it would be a success. I said, why not? Nobody knows anything about wine. And she said, well, they can read a book. So you can imagine the approach and attitude to wine at the time. The other thing that used to be very interesting, they would ask me, no, the other thing which was very interesting was that now people were talking to me socially, men and all sorts of interesting people, and they weren't talking to my husband. And he felt a little left out because in our culture, the man is the one who pours whiskey and serves drinks, and we look after the food and things like that. But it changed. And what changed further was when they finally started saying, but why, as a woman, are you working in alcohol? To begin with, they didn't think that. It was just wine. Wine was such a novelty. So I've been through many such phases. And one last little story I'll tell you. Every time people would, I would go to a party and meet them, and they would say, oh, the wine lady's come, the wine lady. I'd say, please don't call me a wine lady. It sounds like a bag lady. If you must say, the grande dame of wine, I said very pompously, because there was nobody else writing about wine, talking about wine. And our publishing mission was to introduce the wine drinking culture to the country and encourage wine writing in India, in Indians writing about wine. And I think we've come a long way since then. But so when I would go to a party, I would be met with something saying, oh, I've just put this bottle of wine in the freezer to chill, and I'd bring it, and my heart would sink because it was a white wine with a beautiful golden color. They had no concept of storing wine, of keeping it, and I would give simple examples like, would you serve milk that's left outside? No. I said, so you must chill it. They would say, no, but it's corked and we've kept it lying down. Such baby questions. And also now people are drinking wine, as Ruma has said, across the board. And older people are drinking. The young people are really moving things, but they're not uh, afraid of wine anymore. We have succeeded in that direction. We have demystified wine. And what I say is, drink what you like, drink what you enjoy. But please don't say, I'll have a white wine or I'll have a red wine. Would you say you'll have an orange juice or a green juice? You know what, whether it's a grape or it's a mango, and you know all the different names of the mangoes. Well, these grapes have a lot of different names and they all taste different. So don't be embarrassed about asking to see the label and look for the grape. And if you like that grape, drink that. And then move on, and then you can try that same grape from another producer. And so that's how we've been going along with wine culture. And now the magazine is more or less set. It used to be a bi-monthly when I started. And at that time, I just say, oh, I wish I could make it a monthly magazine, because my background is in magazine publishing. I love magazines. I love the combination of text and image. And also the fact that every edition is a new beginning. You start again and you do something different, or you make up for all the faults that were there in the previous issue. But then as time went on, I realized it was too, content heavy. And if I lost my reader, it would be a vanity publication. I wasn't producing or publishing for people like Ruma and the wine producers, who are making such wonderful Indian wines now. So I converted it into a quarterly, and that's what it is. And we've been publishing it with the same publisher who's very excellent and gives me a lot of leeway to make changes at the last minute. And even when there's a spelling mistake on the cover, and I said, no, 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 no. Oh, then no one will notice it. I said, no, it doesn't matter. This has to be changed, because we're educating people through this magazine. But before, if I have a few minutes
Yeah, just
left.
one. I'll give you a couple more minutes, Reva. Then we should pass on to
Yes,
Janet. Thank you so much.
yes. I just wanted to say I wasn't planning to, I had thought I would talk about it, and Michelle has said talk about your the journey in wine, but I hadn't really planned to do that. So I had to ad lib. But what I did want to tell you about is this, sorry, all these papers that I have. That's about the culture of wine, cultural capital of wine. Why is it that we haven't, had a wine drinking culture? We weren't a non-alcoholic country. Whiskey, as I said, beer and other alcohol like that are doing very well. But wine didn't have any capital, cultural capital. And this is what I want to read to you about. Wait a minute, let me find this now. Yes. So in India, wine occupies a curious position. It's aspirational, yet not mainstream, visible, yet not deeply rooted. While wine consumption is growing in urban centers and among younger, globally exposed consumers, it hasn't yet become a widely accepted part of Indian drinking culture. So what explains the gap between visibility and deep cultural acceptance? To answer this, It helps to understand how wine fits into India's broader social fabric through the lens of cultural capital, a concept developed by French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. He argued that non-economic resources like taste, etiquette, and cultural knowledge help individuals gain social status. These assets, he said, come in three forms: embodied, personal taste, skills, mannerisms; objectified, physical items like art, books, wine; and institutionalized, like educational degrees and certifications. In India, wine as embodied cultural capital is still niche. The appreciation of wine, learning how to taste, pair, and talk about it, remains mostly limited to elite cosmopolitan circles. It hasn't yet filtered into the wider social consciousness the way whiskey or even beer has. As objectified capital, a bottle of wine doesn't carry the weight of status. In contrast to China, please correct me if I have this wrong, in China, where a French wine label might signal wealth and global taste, India's luxury signifiers still tend towards gold, real estate, or premium spirits. Whiskey, single malt, not wine.
Thank
Is
you,
what
Reva.
when you
Thank you
invite
so
you want to
much.
set your guests.
So, on that note, talking about China, let's go to Janet. Janet Wang. Thank you very much, Janet.
You. Thank you. It was so fascinating to hear what Ruma and Reva just said. Actually, there's a lot of similarity, as you probably can imagine, with the modern Chinese wine industry, the journey compared to India. But today, because we're talking about cultural attitudes, I thought I would like to start with a discussion about language. I'm sure we all have felt on occasions that different languages could be a barrier to cultural understanding. But equally, the diversity of language and thought can often enrich cultural exchanges as well. So I want to start by looking at the word for wine in Chinese, which is 酒. And hopefully you can see there's a pictographic evolution of this character on my screen. So 酒 in Chinese encompasses all alcoholic drinks. So in European languages, when we talk about wine or vin or vino, it tends to default to grape wine, unless you specify, whether it's plum wine or rice wine. But even then, more established categories would have their own name, like mead, beer, gin, whiskey, etc. But in Chinese, 酒 is the umbrella term for alcoholic beverages. And by itself, it doesn't really default to a certain base ingredient. So 酒 as a standalone word describes the category, but it has this deep cultural connotation that is associated with the word wine, which is not, is kind of lacking in the word alcohol. That's why we don't translate it into alcohol. And this is quite an important point because we tend to associate wine culture as something very indigenous and runs as part of the Chinese DNA. And once we understand this category being quite broad, then 酒 is also used as a suffix. So we would say 啤酒 for beer, or 白酒, which is this fierce distilled Chinese liquor, 黄酒, which means yellow wine, and arguably, 黄酒 is the oldest wine category in China, going back over 9,000 years. We've got archaeology findings of Neolithic settlements dating back to 9,000 years with pots and residuals of alcohol made with a combination of rice, honey, wild grapes, and wild hawthorn. So in one sweep, China could lay claim to have simultaneously invented beer, rice wine, fruit wine, and rice wine. So that's very handy. But if you wonder why you've never heard of 黄酒 as a category before, which is 9,000 years old, I would say 黄酒 is the progenitor of sake. Incidentally, the characters for sake actually means clear wine, which refers to the last step of removing the yellow oxidative color by adding active charcoal. So if you're more familiar with sake, you might have had koshu sake, which is oxidative and yellow in color. And that is very similar to the traditional way of how rice wine is made in China. So having these categories, of course, we also have the category of 葡萄酒, 葡萄 meaning grape. And 80% of the grape wine consumed in China is red. So most people would also refer to grape wine as red wine in China. So it's a bit confusing. So red wine in Chinese is 红酒. And so I think it's confusing, but it's an important point to make, because when you talk to Chinese people, you should bear in mind, if they're doing quite a literal translation and say things like, oh, I like wine, don't assume that they're actually talking about grape wine necessarily. Because if you talk about probability, they might actually be referring to distilled liquor or beer or even huangjiu or sake. So if we use market value as a proxy to this likelihood, baijiu accounts for 70% of the alcohol market in China, and that is a $100 billion market. And beer is the next biggest one, 20% of market share, and that's a $90 billion market. Grape wine only accounts for 5% of the alcoholic beverage market, and we're talking about $8 billion and 600 million liters, just to compare to Ruma's figure earlier. I think it was 27 million liters in India, and it's 600 million liters in China. And it's not often I say, China is a big place with lots of people, but actually India has more people. So the headroom for growth in these emerging markets, I suppose, are great indeed. So what I'm my point is that, there will be a lot of people saying that they like to drink wine, but fewer people maybe actually mean to say they like to drink grape wine. And similarly, if people are saying to you, I drink red wine, maybe what they mean is they drink grape wine in general, because 80% of the grape wine in China consumed is red. So this goes on to another interesting topic, cultural topic. There's an anecdote I'm sure you've heard of, that Chinese people like red wine because red is a lucky color. So is that really true? And my short answer is not really, unfortunately, because if you look at a typical wedding banquet table in China, you definitely find the colorless grain liquor called baijiu being served. And wedding is as auspicious as it gets. So baijiu literally means white wine, not hongjiu, red wine, is often served. The fact that red grape wine is favored in China is more to do with the China's idea of this linkage between wine and health, because wine as a tonic, as a carrier for traditional Chinese medicine, is a very ancient link. That's deeply embedded in the Chinese psyche, that wine and health, wine as a healthy tonic, kind of go hand in hand. And because red wine is fermented with skin contact and has more polyphenols, this has been used in China in recent times to promote it as a more superior, healthy wine. So many Chinese people would buy red wine for their elders, for their parents, as an act of filial piety, right? So you'll also find that when people talk about food and wine pairing in China, this concept is also very ancient. But when we talk about food and wine pairing, we don't just look at the taste compatibility. We also consider the health implication. So for example, what we want from food and wine is that it creates balance in the body. For example, seafood is considered cooling to the body, and so is beer. It has nothing to do with whether you serve it with ice or not. The fact is, intrinsically, seafood is cooling, so is beer, but yellow wine or grape wine are considered warming. So when we do food and wine pairing, they say you shouldn't have beer with seafood. You should have red wine or yellow wine with seafood. So that's the overarching pairing. And once you've done that, you can then look at taste, texture, all the other fun things that goes into a food and wine pairing. So even to this day, it is it is true to say that Chinese people don't tend to drink wine on an empty stomach. So we don't really understand the pub culture here. Wine tends to be accompanying a meal. Even trendy Western style wine bars, they're more like tapas bars in China. Right. So now with this background in mind, I hope it is now more clearer that when we talk about wine, i.e. 酒, it is firstly about fermentation and distillation. And then it is about ingredients, whether it is grain or fruit, by specifying if it is 啤酒, 米酒, 黄酒, 葡萄酒, etc. So a quick plug about my book. So in my book, The Chinese Wine Renaissance, I made the point from the start that I will talk about Chinese wine culture in the context of its wider meaning, i.e. the culture of 酒. Highlighting this point of translation is not a pedantic point. It really gives you a crucial insight that Chinese people perceive wine to be deeply entrenched in our culture, in religion, in customs, in technology, philosophy for thousands of years. So if you encounter Tang Dynasty poetry that's talking about wine, don't assume it is rice wine they are talking about. We know grape wine was particularly favored during the Tang Dynasty. So it is with this understanding that we can fully appreciate cultural attitudes in China about wine, because it is considered a very indigenous and ancient culture. And the Renaissance part in the title of my book then becomes almost self-explanatory. Also, for the book format, I wanted to cover topics that do not date. So it's not a directory of wineries, but about historic and cultural backdrops that is enabling the latest revival of the Chinese grape wine industry. So it is not an industry that's just impacting domestic consumption now. It is also an international phenomenon. And I want to highlight the idea of Renaissance, because in the mind of the Chinese people, wine is not new, or it doesn't belong exclusive to the West. Even European grape and vinifera varietals, they came to China on the Silk Road, and grape wine has been made in China since over 2,000 years ago. And although, because you can imagine, we had lots of dynasty changes, lots of upheavals. So in the intermittent periods, tea culture and rice wine culture had been much more continuous than grape wine, because grape was not domesticated in China. It remained quite an expensive fruit. So to make wine out of fruit is more costly. And when there's war and social upheaval, the costly production of grape wine tend to be a bit of a victim, whereas rice wine, grain-based wine, have managed to survive. So having said all of that, I am now doing a bit of a U-turn, and to say that today, most Chinese people still do consider top grape wines to come from the old world or the Western worlds. So they certainly still considered Bordeaux, Burgundy, and even recently Italy. They make the most prestigious wines. This is because in China's recent history, and certainly within living memory, the grape wine industry has had very severe setbacks. So what most people can relate to is that since the 80s and 90s, there were lots of Western joint ventures and Western wine experts who have brought into China the investments and expertise to kickstart the grape wine industry again in China. However, there is a difference in what the Chinese people would consider Western know-how and technology transfer and wine culture. So whilst Chinese people do consider modern grape wines to be made to European styles and using the most up-to-date European skills. Wine culture is something still very old and native to China. And what makes the wine industry of China today so interesting is to see now the coming together of Western style winemaking and China's own wine culture heritage. And on top of that is the idea of terroir. You know, China has this vast terrain with very incredibly unique and diverse terroirs, from depression in the Turpan area in Xinjiang, which is below sea level vineyards, to the highest Loess Plateau, to the Tibetan Plateau, for example. So there are lots of very evocative places to discover. And talking of terroir as a concept, again, I would like to just quickly share another linguistic point of interest, because when you go to France, people will talk very proudly about this concept of terroir. They say, "Oh, there's nothing quite like it." Blah blah blah. It's about the soil, the place, the uniqueness of a place. And I remember having this long discussion about terroir with a French producer, and at the end of it, I said, actually, yes, you're absolutely right, but we have exactly the same word in Chinese, and that is 风土. 风土 means wind and soil, literally. And it also describes this elusive notion of how the wind, the soil, and local customs would impart certain characters on the people and the produce of a place. Right, so this is why I think wine is so magical, because it's an elegant way to explain very nuanced cultural concepts. You know, through a language, through the shared language of wine, we can sometimes find foreign ideas immediately relatable and can be immediately appreciated. Right, so now I just want to wrap up by saying today, the modern wine industry in China is in some way similar to India, where there are lots of young people drinking wine and a lot of females who are making choices in terms of what they want to drink. So if you read about the big headline numbers of consumption in China since COVID, Chinese wine consumption have dropped significantly. But if you look at the details in those numbers, I think they point to a much more positive future. So, for example, there's premiumization. People are drinking better, drinking less but better. And also, domestically produced wine is on the rise. Now it's more like 60 domestic, 40% imported, whereas before it's been 50-50 or even 30-70 for a long time. And globally, we're seeing people are moving towards lower alcohol options. But in China, lower alcohol actually means going from the 52-degree baijiu liquor to 16% wine. You know, 16% in the north of China is not considered terribly alcoholic. And then young people, generationally, in the West, we're seeing people switching away from wine into lower alcohol options. But in China, young people are switching from baijiu, the liquor, to wine. So again, the future seems to be quite bright for the Chinese wine market. And I also feel now that this cultural confidence, which Reva and Ruma have talked about as well in relation to India, that's very much alive also in China. 10 years ago, lots of wine producers just want to make a good Bordeaux blend that could fool the experts in blind tastings. But now they are wanting to express their cultural identity. They want to talk about their own terroir. And consumers equally are demanding this reassertion, this feel-good factor of drinking Chinese wines. So I think the future, the cultural narrative of Chinese wines is just becoming interesting for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you. Actually, thank you, all of you, Reva and Ruma, for really a very informative session. I think each presentation offered actually a unique angle and also valuable insight in the understanding of the cultural differences in wine, particularly in the context of India and China. I know we're very close to our 7 o'clock deadline, but Maybe Andrea, you could address a few questions.
There's
then,
one or two here. Thank you, Michelle. The first one I think came from yourself and probably Ruma.
yeah.
Which are the locally grown grape varieties that do well?
International varieties do very well because now the hybrids are on their way out. So that would be Shiraz when it comes to the red grapes. There's a fondness for Cabernet Sauvignon, but we're not quite there yet. In terms of white, I would say Chenin Blanc does really, really well. And there are pockets of all, I mean, you have Chardonnay, you have Tempranillo, you have quite a few of those, but basically it's Shiraz when it comes to red and Chenin when it comes to white.
Okay. And Becky Sue was asking about China. In China, is all wine considered warming?
So in Chinese medicine, in traditional Chinese medicine, wine, grape wine is considered warming. So as I was saying, it has nothing to do with how you serve it, whether it's white wine served chilled or red wine at room temperature. Actually, the quality, the intrinsic quality of grape wine is considered warming, and so is yellow wine. But pijiu, on the other hand, i.e. beer, is considered cooling. Yeah.
I think, and also Becky was saying, how can non-Chinese people learn about what foods are acceptable to pair with certain wines?
Well, you might want to start with a basic understanding of Chinese medicine, and it's not something you can pick up very quickly. But there are books like cheats guides you can buy in China with pictures that tell you which food goes together and which foods and wine or drinks to avoid. Yeah, so there are guides.
Is that covered in your book as well, Janet, or not?
Not this type of pairing. I talked about pairing, but more generically. Yes.
Maybe there's an opportunity.
Yeah, maybe that's another book actually. Interesting.
I just want to make a comment that talking about wine culture in both our countries, Indian wine culture is the exact opposite because it's so ancient in China. I didn't realize that. And you know, you have so many different wines, and and you have to call them by their fruit wine or whatever. In India, wine is still very new.
Interesting.
No,
Okay.
it's not, that was the cultural detail I was trying to bring out. In the West, because wine is so much a part of your culture, you absorb it automatically.
Yes.
And then you have that cultural capital. But in India, we didn't have that.
That's an interesting point.
But now, having said that, I have to say that wine is here to stay. There's never any social event, whether it's a women's kitty party or a society wedding, wine is always served.
Maybe we'll see. We'll know when things have changed, when there's maybe some male writers. Obviously, your ladies are dominating the market at the moment. So